The morning sun painted the Atlantic Ocean in shades of gold and amber as Janet Cole climbed the spiral staircase of Brookdale Lighthouse. Her legs moved with practiced ease, though she was now 66 years old. Each step echoed in the hollow tower, a sound she had heard thousands of times over the past 18 years. The staircase itself was a work of art, 127 cast iron steps spiraling upward in a perfect helix. Janet's hand trailed along the smooth railing, worn by more than a century of lighthouse keepers who had climbed these same stairs. She knew every step intimately, knew which ones creaked slightly, which ones had small imperfections in their surface, which ones caught the morning light in particular ways. Janet reached the top and stepped out onto the gallery deck. The salty wind greeted her like an old friend, pulling at her gray hair and making her squint. She did not mind. This was her favorite moment of every day, the quiet hour when the world seemed to hold its breath before fully waking. The gallery deck was a narrow walkway that circled the lighthouse lens room, protected by an ornate iron railing painted white. From here, 70 feet above the rocky shore, the view was spectacular. The ocean stretched to the horizon, its surface rippling with the morning breeze. Seagulls wheeled and called in the air around the tower, their cries mixing with the sound of waves against rocks. Below her, the small town of Brookdale stretched along the rocky Maine coastline. The houses looked like toys from this height, their white and blue painted walls bright against the dark green pine forests behind them. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, straight columns in the still morning air. The fishing boats were already heading out, their engines creating small white trails in the calm water. Janet could identify each boat: the Mary Catherine, the Sea Dancer, the Morning Star. She had watched them come and go for so many years. Janet pulled her thick wool sweater closer and began her morning inspection. She walked around the gallery deck, checking every section of the railing. Her movements were methodical, careful. She examined welds and joints, looking for any sign of rust or weakness. She tested the drainage holes that kept water from pooling on the deck. She checked the condition of the paint, noting places where touch-up work would be needed in the spring. She had learned long ago that details mattered, that small problems became big ones if you ignored them. This philosophy had served her well in her previous career, and it served her equally well now in this simpler life. The lighthouse itself was a beautiful structure, built in 1887. The white tower stood 70 feet tall, its red cap visible for miles. The construction was solid. Granite blocks fitted together with such precision that the tower had withstood more than 130 years of Atlantic storms. The light at the top was now automated, controlled by computers and sensors that adjusted its intensity based on weather conditions and time of day. Modern technology had replaced the old rotating Fresnel lens with a more efficient LED system, though the original lens was preserved and displayed in the small maritime museum in town. Janet's official job was maintenance and monitoring, making sure everything worked correctly. She checked systems, performed routine maintenance, cleaned the lens room, kept detailed records, and reported any problems to the district office. It was steady, predictable work that paid modestly, but came with the benefit of living in the keeper's cottage rent-free. But the lighthouse was more than a job to Janet. It was her sanctuary, her refuge, her home. She lived in the small keeper's cottage attached to the base of the tower. It was a simple place, one bedroom, a kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, and a bathroom. The walls were thick stone, keeping the heat in during winter and the cool in during summer. The cottage had been modernized somewhat over the years. It had electricity, running water, a furnace, and even internet, but it retained its historic character. The original wooden floors creaked pleasantly underfoot. The windows were deep set with wide sills, perfect for setting plants or books. The fireplace, though supplemented by modern heating, still worked, and Janet used it on cold nights, enjoying the snap and crackle of burning wood. She had made the cottage her own over 18 years. The walls held watercolor paintings of seascapes that she had done herself, a hobby she had taken up during her early years here. Bookshelves lined one wall of the living room, filled with maritime history, navigation manuals, weather guides, and classic novels. A comfortable reading chair sat by the window with the best view of the ocean. The kitchen, though small, was well organized and contained everything she needed. Janet finished her inspection and went back inside. She descended the stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the smooth metal railing. The interior of the tower was cool and dim, the thick walls blocking out most of the morning warmth. Halfway down, she paused at a small window and looked out at the town again. She could see people beginning their day, someone walking a dog on the beach, a truck making an early delivery to Morrison's store, lights coming on in the bakery where Sarah Chen would be starting the day's bread. When she reached the bottom, she paused to write in the logbook, a habit from her years of training. Even though modern systems recorded everything automatically, wind speed, temperature, barometric pressure, visibility, system status, Janet maintained her own handwritten records. There was something satisfying about the physical act of writing, about creating a permanent record in her own hand. November 1st, she wrote in her neat, precise handwriting. 6:30 a.m., clear skies. Light breeze from the northeast, approximately 8 knots. All systems functioning normally. Water temperature 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Air temperature 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility excellent, estimated at 15 miles. Barometric pressure 30.15 inches and steady. Sunrise at 6:24 a.m. Forecast calls for continued clear conditions through midday, with possible cloud development in the afternoon. She closed the logbook and walked through the connecting door to her cottage. The kitchen was warm, the old radiator clicking and hissing softly. Janet made herself a pot of coffee, strong and black, using beans from a local roaster in the next town over. While the coffee brewed, she prepared a simple breakfast: oatmeal with dried cranberries and walnuts, a sliced apple, a glass of orange juice. She sat at the small table by the window, the one that looked out over the harbor and the town beyond. This was her morning ritual, unchanged for years: coffee, breakfast, and the quiet observation of the world waking up. From here, she could see the harbor and the town beyond. Brookdale was not a large place, only about 800 permanent residents, though that number swelled to several thousand during the summer tourist season. The town had one main street with the essential businesses: Morrison's general store, the post office, a small bank, the library, a diner, a hardware store, and a few other shops. There were 3 churches, an elementary school, a volunteer fire department, and a small medical clinic. Now, in early November, the tourists were gone. The bed and breakfast had closed for the season. The gift shops were shuttered. The ice cream stand by the beach was dark and empty. The town belonged to the locals again, and it settled into its winter rhythm, quieter, slower, more insular. Janet liked it this way. She appreciated the quiet, the slower pace, the familiar faces. She had lived in Brookdale for 18 years, ever since she had arrived one cold December day, carrying only 2 suitcases and a heart full of pain she could not speak about. She remembered that first day clearly. The lighthouse position had been vacant for 6 months after the previous keeper retired. The town had advertised the position, but there were few applicants. Not many people wanted to live in isolation, even the relative isolation of a small town. Not many people had the skills or temperament for the work, but Janet had both. She had shown up with impeccable references, carefully edited to remove any hint of why she had left her previous career, and had been hired on the spot. The town manager had been relieved to find someone qualified and willing to start immediately. The townspeople had been curious at first, of course. A woman in her late 40s, arriving alone, taking the lighthouse keeper position that had been vacant for months. They had asked questions. Where was she from? Did she have family? What had she done before? Janet had answered vaguely, politely. She was from the coast, she said. Various places. She had moved around a lot. She had worked in maritime services, nothing glamorous. Her family was scattered, not close. She preferred not to talk about the past. She was looking for a fresh start, a quiet place, meaningful work. The people of Brookdale had respected that. New Englanders understood privacy, understood that sometimes people needed to start fresh. They had welcomed her without pressing for details she clearly did not want to share. Over the years, Janet had become part of the community. Not central to it, she was too quiet, too private for that, but definitely part of it. She was known as a reliable, quiet woman who kept to herself but was always willing to help when needed. She volunteered at the local library every Tuesday afternoon, organizing the maritime history section, helping catalog new acquisitions, assisting patrons with research. The head librarian, Sarah Martinez, had tried multiple times to draw Janet into deeper friendship, to get her to join book clubs or social events, but Janet had always politely declined. She maintained boundaries, kept relationships cordial, but not intimate. She helped her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, with her garden every spring. Mrs. Peterson was 83 now, a widow who had lived in Brookdale her entire life. She could no longer do heavy work, so Janet came over once a week during growing season to help with digging, planting, weeding, and harvesting. In return, Mrs. Peterson shared vegetables and taught Janet her canning recipes. They had a comfortable relationship built on mutual helpfulness rather than deep emotional connection. Janet attended the annual town meetings, always sitting in the back, always listening more than speaking. She voted on town issues, contributed to community projects, paid her taxes. She went to the Summer Lobster Festival and the Winter Holiday Bazaar. She donated to the volunteer fire department and the school fundraisers. But she never talked about her past, and the townspeople had stopped asking. Janet finished her coffee and washed the cup. She had work to do today. The lighthouse needed its monthly deep cleaning, and she wanted to replace some of the weather stripping on the north side of the tower before winter truly arrived. The forecast showed a storm system developing offshore, and she wanted everything secure before it arrived. She put on her work clothes, sturdy jeans, a flannel shirt, thick boots, and gathered her supplies. A bucket with cleaning solution, rags, a scrub brush, tools for the weather stripping replacement, and her work gloves. Then she headed back up the spiral staircase, ready to spend the day doing the simple, honest work that had become her life. As she climbed, carrying her supplies, Janet tried not to think about the other life she had left behind. But sometimes, especially on days like this when the wind came from the northeast and carried the smell of deep water, the memories came anyway. She had been Commander Janet Cole once, United States Coast Guard. She had led rescue operations in some of the most dangerous waters on the East Coast. She had saved hundreds of lives over her 25-year career. She had earned medals and commendations. She had been respected, even feared a little, by those under her command. She had been confident, skilled, fearless, or at least she had appeared that way to others. And then, on one terrible day, everything had changed. Janet pushed the memory away, as she always did. That was the past. This was now. She was the lighthouse keeper of Brookdale, nothing more, nothing less, and that was enough. It had to be enough. She reached the lens room and set down her supplies. Through the windows, she could see clouds beginning to build on the horizon. The storm was coming, just as predicted. She would be ready for it. The weeks passed in their familiar rhythm. Janet maintained her lighthouse, kept her careful records, and lived her quiet life. November brought colder weather. The tourists were completely gone now. The fishing boats came back earlier each afternoon as the days grew shorter and the water grew rougher. Janet's daily routine varied little. She woke each morning before dawn, climbed the tower to check the light and survey the weather, made her breakfast, and then spent her days on maintenance tasks. She cleaned, painted, repaired, monitored, recorded. The work was never quite done. There was always something that needed attention in a structure exposed to salt air and Atlantic weather. In the evenings, she read, painted watercolors, or worked on a needlepoint project she had started years ago. Sometimes she watched the news or a documentary on her small television. She went to bed early and slept deeply, the sound of waves a constant lullaby. On Tuesday afternoons, Janet walked into town for her volunteer shift at the Brookdale Public Library. The walk took 20 minutes along the coastal road. Janet enjoyed it, regardless of weather. She liked the rhythm of walking, the chance to observe the changing seasons, the small details that others might miss. A seal's head bobbing in the surf, a hawk perched in a dead tree, the way ice formed in patterns on puddles. The library was a small brick building on Main Street, built in 1923 by a wealthy summer resident who had wanted to give something back to the town. Inside, it smelled of old paper and furniture polish, a scent Janet found comforting. "Good afternoon, Janet," called Sarah Martinez, the head librarian. Sarah was in her mid-40s, energetic and warm, with dark, curly hair and bright brown eyes. She had been trying to befriend Janet for years, with limited success. Janet was polite, but maintained her boundaries. "Good afternoon, Sarah," Janet replied. She hung her coat on the rack and went to her usual section, maritime history and navigation. She loved this corner of the library. The books here were old, their spines cracked, their pages yellowed. They told stories of ships and sailors, of storms survived and challenges overcome. The maritime section was not heavily used, but Janet kept it meticulously organized anyway. She arranged books by subject and chronology, created displays highlighting particular topics, wrote detailed catalog cards when new acquisitions arrived. It was work she found satisfying. Today, she had a stack of books that had been returned to repair and reshelve. She settled into her work, carefully mending torn pages with archival tape, reinforcing loose bindings with special glue, gently cleaning dust from covers. After an hour, Sarah came over with 2 cups of tea. "Taking a break?" she asked hopefully. Janet accepted the tea. "For a moment, thank you." Sarah sat in the chair across from Janet's work table. "You know, we're starting a book club, first Monday of each month. We'd love to have you join." "I appreciate the invitation, but I don't think so." "We're reading maritime fiction," Sarah said with a knowing smile. "I thought that might interest you." Janet smiled slightly. Sarah was persistent. She had to give her that. "What's the first book?" "The Perfect Storm." I know. It's about a tragedy. But it's also beautifully written and very informative about fishing and weather. Janet had read the book when it came out, had found it both compelling and difficult. It hit too close to home in many ways. "I'll think about it," she said, which they both knew meant no. Sarah sighed but didn't push. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, drinking their tea. Then Sarah went back to her desk and Janet returned to her work. Janet spent 2 hours organizing the shelves, repairing damaged books with tape and glue, and helping the occasional patron find what they needed. An elderly man wanted books about lighthouse construction. Janet helped him find several, including a comprehensive history of Maine lighthouses. A teenager needed information about fishing techniques for a school project. Janet directed her to both modern manuals and historical accounts, explaining how techniques had evolved over time. She enjoyed helping patrons, sharing knowledge without revealing its source. She could explain navigation principles, discuss weather patterns, describe ship construction, all while maintaining the fiction that she was simply a well-read enthusiast rather than a trained professional. After her library shift, Janet stopped at Morrison's General Store to buy groceries. The store was a Brookdale institution, run by the Morrison family for 3 generations. Tom Morrison, the current owner, was a friendly man in his 60s with a gray beard and kind eyes. His wife Linda managed the register while Tom handled ordering and stocking. "Afternoon, Janet," he greeted her as she entered. The bell above the door chimed, a sound Janet had heard thousands of times. "Getting cold out there." "It is," Janet agreed. She picked up a basket and began selecting items: bread from the local bakery, cheese, eggs from a nearby farm, vegetables that had been stored from the fall harvest, coffee, tea, butter, milk. Morrison's was old-fashioned in the best sense. The wooden floors creaked underfoot. The shelves were neatly organized but packed with an eclectic mix of goods. Everything from canned soup to fishing supplies, from fresh produce to hardware items. There was a section of local crafts: hand-knitted scarves, pottery, preserves, honey. A bulletin board by the door was covered with local notices: yard sales, lost pets, services offered, community events. "Storm coming in this weekend," Tom said conversationally as Janet selected apples from a barrel. "Big one, according to the weather service. First real nor'easter of the season." Janet paused, an apple in her hand. "How big?" "They're saying sustained winds of 50 miles per hour, gusts up to 70. Heavy rain, possibly mixing with snow. Possible coastal flooding." Tom shrugged. "You know how it is. Could be nothing, could be everything. Weather service has a tendency to overdramatize. But I'd make sure your lighthouse is ready." "I will," Janet said. She felt a small flutter of anxiety in her chest, an old feeling she recognized. Weather had always made her nervous, ever since. She pushed the thought away again. She continued shopping, adding a few extra supplies to her basket. Extra batteries, candles, canned goods. Better to be prepared. Living alone in a lighthouse during a major storm required preparation. At the register, Linda Morrison rang up her purchases. "Stocking up, I see. Smart woman. Last big storm we had, we lost power for 3 days." "I remember," Janet said. That had been 2 years ago. A February blizzard that had buried the town under 2 feet of snow and knocked down power lines all along the coast. Janet's backup generator had kept essential systems running, but she had spent 3 days essentially snowed in, keeping the lighthouse functioning while the town dug itself out. She paid for her groceries and walked home. The sky was already darkening, though it was only 4:30. The sun set early this time of year, and would set even earlier as November progressed toward the winter solstice. The wind had picked up, coming in cold gusts from the ocean. Janet could see the waves growing larger, white caps forming on their peaks. Back at the cottage, she unpacked her groceries and made a simple dinner: scrambled eggs with toast, a small salad, a cup of tea. As she ate, she thought about Tom's warning. A nor'easter. They were common this time of year, but they could be dangerous. The lighthouse would be fine. It had survived over 100 years of storms. But Janet needed to make sure everything was secure. After dinner, she spent an hour checking emergency supplies. She had flashlights with fresh batteries, extra bulbs, candles, matches stored in waterproof containers, a battery-powered radio and weather radio, extra food and water, a first aid kit, emergency flares, and a backup communication system in case the phone lines went down. She checked the backup generator that provided power if the main lines went down. Fuel level good, oil clean, battery charged. She tested it briefly, making sure it started smoothly. Everything was in order. But still, Janet felt uneasy. She told herself it was just normal caution, nothing more. She was not that person anymore. She was not Commander Cole, responsible for rescue operations and life or death decisions. She was just Janet, the lighthouse keeper. Her job was to keep the light running. That was all. Still, old habits were hard to break. Before bed, she climbed to the top of the lighthouse one more time. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the dark sky. The Milky Way stretched overhead, a river of light. The ocean was relatively calm, though she could feel the change coming in the air. A heaviness, a pressure, a sense of building energy. On the horizon, she could see clouds gathering, darker than the darkness around them. They were still far away, but they were coming. The storm was real. Janet went back down and prepared for bed. She set out her storm gear: heavy waterproof jacket and pants, boots, gloves, a waterproof hat. She charged her phone and her backup radio. She set multiple alarms, knowing she would need to check the lighthouse throughout the storm. As she lay in bed, listening to the wind beginning to pick up, Janet thought about storms. She had been through so many in her career: hurricanes, nor'easters, sudden squalls. She had led rescues in conditions that would terrify most people. She had seen waves 40 feet high, winds that could knock a person down, rain so heavy you could barely breathe. And she had seen what the ocean could do when it was angry. She had pulled bodies from the water. She had watched ships break apart. She had held the hands of rescued sailors as they wept with relief and terror. A storm was coming. And despite everything, despite 18 years of quiet life, Janet felt a familiar tension building inside her. The tension of someone who knew storms were dangerous, who knew people made mistakes, who knew that preparation and vigilance were the difference between safety and disaster. She fell asleep finally, but her dreams were troubled, full of dark water and distant calls for help. Janet had been right to be cautious. By Friday evening, the weather had changed completely. The clear skies were gone, replaced by low, heavy clouds the color of slate. The wind howled around the lighthouse, making the windows rattle in their frames. The ocean had transformed from its usual deep blue to an angry gray-green, waves crashing against the rocks with tremendous force, sending spray 20 feet into the air. Janet spent Friday securing everything outside. She brought in her garden tools from the small shed behind the cottage. She tied down anything that could blow away: the garbage cans, a small bench, plant pots. She checked every window and door, making sure latches were secure and weather stripping was intact. She walked around the entire lighthouse base, looking for anything that could become a projectile in high winds. The lighthouse itself was solid, but she went through her checklist carefully anyway. The automated light was functioning perfectly, its beam cutting through the growing darkness every 10 seconds. She checked the backup systems, the emergency protocols, the communication equipment. She reviewed the Coast Guard contact numbers, the emergency response procedures, the storm protocols. The fishing boats had all come in early, secured to their moorings with extra lines. The harbor was full of vessels riding uneasily at anchor, their bows pointing into the wind. Janet could see people on the town dock, adding extra fenders to boats, checking lines, making last-minute preparations. By Friday night, the storm had truly arrived. Rain hammered against the cottage walls with the sound of flung gravel. The wind screamed like a living thing, finding every crack and crevice, making the old building groan and creak. Janet sat in her living room, listening to the weather radio. Major nor'easter making landfall along the Maine coast, the announcer said in a calm, professional voice. The storm has intensified more rapidly than anticipated. Winds sustained at 55 miles per hour with gusts recorded up to 72. Coastal flood warnings in effect for all coastal regions. Storm surge of 3 to 5 feet expected at high tide. All residents should stay indoors and avoid travel. Small craft advisory remains in effect. Mariners should seek safe harbor immediately. Janet turned down the volume but left the radio on. She tried to read a book, but found herself distracted, listening to the storm instead. She could hear the structure of the lighthouse resonating with each gust of wind. She could hear waves crashing against the rocks below, the sound like distant thunder. She could hear rain drumming on the roof, running in streams through the gutters. This was a big one, she could tell. Not the biggest she had experienced. She had been through Category 2 hurricanes that made this look mild, but significant. The building intensity, the rapid development, the timing with high tide. All of these factors made it potentially dangerous. The power went out at 9 o'clock. One moment there was light and the quiet hum of electricity. The next, there was darkness and silence broken only by the storm. Janet was ready. She lit several candles, placed them safely around the room, one on the kitchen counter, one on the coffee table, one on the windowsill. The backup generator kicked in after a moment with a reassuring rumble, providing emergency power to essential systems. The lighthouse beam continued its faithful rotation, automated systems running smoothly on generator power. Janet checked her watch. High tide was at 2:30 in the morning. That would be when the storm surge was most dangerous. She should try to rest before then, but she knew sleep would be difficult. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the storm. The rain was so heavy she could barely see the harbor, just shapes and shadows illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning. The wind was a constant roar, punctuated by stronger gusts that made the whole building shudder. Around midnight, she dozed off in her chair, exhausted despite her anxiety. She slept fitfully, troubled by dreams of dark water and distant voices calling for help, the same dreams that had haunted her for 18 years. She woke suddenly at 3 in the morning. Something had changed. The sound of the storm was different, even louder, more intense. The building was shaking more violently. And there was a new sound, a deep groaning from the ocean that she recognized from her years of experience. The waves were truly massive now. Janet got out of bed and pulled on her robe. She walked to the window and looked out, pressing her face close to the glass to see through the rain. What she saw made her heart skip. The storm had intensified dramatically, beyond what had been forecast. The waves were massive, 20 feet or higher, crashing over the breakwater with such force that they were sending spray halfway up the lighthouse tower. The rain was horizontal, driven by the incredible wind, and there was something else, a strange, pulsing quality to the wind that suggested it might be getting even worse. This was more than a typical nor'easter. This was approaching hurricane strength. The forecast had been wrong, or the storm had developed faster than predicted. Either way, this was dangerous. Janet's training kicked in automatically. This was beyond a typical nor'easter. This was dangerous. She needed to check the lighthouse, make sure everything was still functioning. If the light failed during a storm like this, any vessel caught out there would be in serious trouble. She dressed quickly in waterproof clothes and boots, heavy-duty rain pants and jacket, rubber boots with good tread, a waterproof hat with a chin strap, gloves. She grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, waterproof, shock-resistant, with a bright LED beam, and headed for the tower door. The moment she opened it, the wind tried to rip the door from her hands. Janet held on with both hands, fighting against the pressure. The wind was incredibly strong, stronger than anything in the forecast. She managed to get through the door and pull it closed behind her, leaning against it with her full weight. Inside the tower, there was some shelter, but she could hear the storm battering the structure. The metal stairs rang with each gust of wind, like someone striking a bell. The whole tower was vibrating slightly. Not dangerous. The structure was solid, but noticeable in a way she had never felt before. She began climbing the stairs, one hand on the railing, moving carefully. The interior of the tower was dark except for her flashlight beam. At each small window, she could see the storm raging outside. Rain, spray, darkness illuminated by lightning. When she reached the top, Janet carefully opened the door to the gallery deck. The force of the wind nearly knocked her down. She grabbed the railing and pulled herself outside, keeping low. The rain stung her face like needles. The wind was a physical force, trying to push her off her feet. The noise was incredible, a constant roar that made thinking difficult. But the light was still functioning. The beam swept around, automated and precise, cutting through the storm. Janet checked the mechanisms, made sure nothing had come loose. She examined the mounting bolts, the electrical connections, the housing seals. Everything was secure. The lighthouse was doing its job. She was about to go back inside when she saw something that made her freeze. Far out in the ocean, barely visible through the rain and darkness, was a light. Not the steady light of a large ship, but something smaller, irregular. A light that appeared and disappeared as the waves rose and fell. A boat. Someone was out there in this storm. Janet's pulse quickened. She stared at the light, trying to get a better look. It was hard to see anything through the rain, which was falling in sheets now. But the light appeared again, this time with what looked like a red flare. A distress signal. For a moment, Janet was paralyzed. Part of her wanted to go back inside, to call the Coast Guard, to let someone else handle it. She was not that person anymore. She had left that life behind. She was 66 years old, retired, removed from responsibility. This was not her problem. But another part of her, the part she had tried to bury for 18 years, was already calculating. The boat was about 2 miles offshore, she estimated. In these conditions, the Coast Guard station in Portsmouth was at least 45 minutes away, probably longer given the weather. The boat might not have 45 minutes. At the rate the storm was pushing things toward shore, they would hit the rocks in maybe 20 minutes, 30 at most. She couldn't look away from the light. Red flare, distress signal. 3 people at least, given the size of the light source. Recreational boat, probably, caught out when the storm intensified beyond forecast. Janet pulled out her radio and switched to the Coast Guard emergency frequency. Mayday, mayday, this is Brookdale Lighthouse. I have visual confirmation of a vessel in distress approximately 2 miles northeast of my position. Single light source, possible red flare observed. Over. She waited. Static. The storm was interfering with radio transmission. She tried again, adjusting frequencies. Mayday, mayday. This is Brookdale Lighthouse calling Coast Guard Portsmouth. Vessel in distress, visual confirmation. Over. More static. Then a broken voice, words cutting in and out. Dale Light, read, repeat. This is Brookdale Lighthouse. I have visual confirmation of a vessel in distress, approximately 2 miles northeast, bearing 045 degrees from lighthouse. Vessel showing distress signals. Conditions severe. Over. Copy. Attempting. Respond. Conditions. The transmission cut out entirely. Janet tried several more times, but got only static. The storm was creating too much interference. She was on her own. Janet's mind raced. What should she do? What could she do? She was 66 years old. She had no boat, no crew, no equipment beyond what was in the lighthouse. She had been out of the service for 18 years. Her skills were rusty. Her body was older. Her confidence was shattered by that one terrible day so long ago. But she had knowledge. She had experience. And right now, someone out there needed help. The red flare appeared again, weaker this time. They were getting desperate. Janet made her decision. She was not going to stand here and watch people die. Not again. Not ever again. Part 4. The Decision. Janet stood on the gallery deck for another long moment, rain soaking through her waterproof jacket, despite its supposed impermeability, wind threatening to tear her from the railing. The light from the boat in distress flickered again. Definitely weaker this time. They were running out of flares, running out of options, running out of time. She went back inside the tower, her mind already racing through possibilities. She descended the stairs as quickly as she dared, her boots clanging on the metal steps. In the cottage, she grabbed her phone and called 911. The phone rang 3 times. 4. Janet's heart pounded. Finally, 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. This is Janet Cole at Brookdale Lighthouse. I have visual confirmation of a vessel in distress approximately 2 miles northeast of the lighthouse. They appear to be showing distress signals. I attempted to raise the Coast Guard on radio, but storm interference is preventing communication. You need to contact them immediately and relay this information? Copy that, ma'am. Can you describe exactly what you see? Single light source. Intermittent visibility due to wave height. I observed what appeared to be a red distress flare approximately 5 minutes ago, and another 1 minute ago. Vessel appears to be drifting toward the rocks north of the harbor entrance. Given the current wind direction and speed, I estimate they will make contact with the rocks in approximately 15 to 20 minutes. Janet heard keyboard clicking. I'm contacting the Coast Guard Portsmouth station now. Please stay on the line. There was a pause. Janet could hear muffled conversation on the other end. She moved to the window, trying to see the boat light again, but visibility was nearly 0 from ground level. The dispatcher came back on. Ma'am, the Coast Guard says they're launching a rescue boat, but weather conditions are severe. Estimated arrival time is 45 minutes to 1 hour. Janet's jaw tightened. She had known that would be the answer, but hearing it confirmed made everything more real. Understood. That may not be soon enough. I'll do what I can from here. Ma'am, you should not attempt any rescue yourself. Coast Guard protocol. I understand protocol. I'm not launching a boat. I'm the lighthouse keeper. I'll maintain visual contact and try to provide guidance. But you need to understand that if the Coast Guard takes an hour to get here, those people will be dead. I'm going to do whatever I can to prevent that. Ma'am, Janet hung up. She did not have time to argue about protocol. She ran back up the tower stairs, her legs burning with the effort. At the top, she went back out onto the gallery deck. The boat light was still visible, but it had moved closer to the rocky shoreline. Janet's trained eye could see the danger immediately. The currents and wind were pushing the vessel toward a particularly dangerous section of coast, where jagged rocks created a maze that had wrecked ships for 2 centuries. The locals called it Devil's Teeth, and with good reason. Janet pulled out binoculars from the equipment locker, military-grade, waterproof, with excellent low-light capability, and tried to get a better look. Through the rain and darkness, she could make out more details now. It was a recreational boat, maybe 30 feet long. Too small to be out in these conditions, but then these conditions had developed much faster than predicted. 3 people on board. She could see their shapes moving on the deck, silhouettes against their cabin light. The boat's engine appeared to be running. She could see occasional spray from the exhaust. But it was clear they had lost steering or power. They were being pushed helplessly toward the rocks. She could see them trying to control the vessel, could imagine their growing panic as they realized what was about to happen. Janet's mind went into a mode she had not accessed in 18 years. Tactical assessment, problem solving, resource evaluation. She was no longer Janet the lighthouse keeper. Whether she wanted to be or not, she was Commander Cole again. The situation was clear. The boat had maybe 20 minutes before it hit the rocks, possibly less if the current was stronger than she estimated. The Coast Guard could not arrive in time. The local volunteer rescue squad had no boat capable of handling these seas. If those 3 people were going to survive, they needed help right now. And the only person who could provide that help was Janet. She looked at the lighthouse beam, sweeping its automated pattern. The beam was powerful, visible for 20 miles in clear weather. In this storm, its range was reduced significantly, maybe 5 to 7 miles, but it was still the strongest light source available. The beam was over 1 million candle power, focused through precision lenses, capable of cutting through fog, rain, and darkness. An idea formed in her mind. It was risky. It might not work. It required skills she had not used in nearly 2 decades. But it was better than doing nothing. It was better than watching 3 people die while she stood safely in her tower. Janet ran down to the control room where the lighthouse mechanisms were housed. The automated system was modern, controlled by computers and sensors. But the lighthouse still had its original manual controls, maintained as a backup system required by Coast Guard regulations. Janet had tested them regularly as part of her duties, monthly checks to ensure they still functioned, but she had never actually used them for anything more than routine maintenance. The manual control panel was a beautiful piece of engineering from another era. Heavy brass switches, precise mechanical controls, analog gauges. It had been designed in an age when lighthouse keepers were expected to maintain direct control of their lights, to adjust them based on conditions and needs. She studied the controls, her fingers hovering over switches she had only touched in practice. Could she really do this? Could she trust herself after all these years? Could she trust her judgment, her skills, her ability to make the right calls? The boat light flickered again, weaker. She was running out of time. They were running out of time. Janet threw the first switch. The automated system disengaged with a soft click. The lighthouse beam stopped its steady rotation. For a moment, there was only darkness, and Janet felt a moment of pure panic. What if the manual system did not engage? What if she had just made things worse? Then she engaged the manual controls. The beam came back on, now under her direct control. She could aim it, focus it, change its pattern, modulate its intensity. It was like stepping back in time, to an era when lighthouse keepers had been the only hope for ships in trouble, when a skilled keeper with a powerful light could mean the difference between life and death. Janet directed the beam out toward the boat in distress. She found it after a moment of searching, a small white shape being tossed by massive waves, looking impossibly fragile in the violence of the storm. She locked the beam on it, giving the people on board a reference point, a sign that someone knew they were there, that they were not alone. But that was only the first step. Now came the hard part. Janet needed to communicate with them. She needed to guide them away from the rocks and toward the safe channel into the harbor. But she had no radio contact. She had already confirmed that. She had only one tool available to her: light. Morse code. It was an old system, developed in the 1830s and 1840s, taught in Coast Guard training, but rarely used anymore in the age of radio and satellite communication. Everyone relied on radios now, on GPS, on electronic navigation systems. But Janet had studied Morse code extensively during her training. She had used it in exercises, had been required to demonstrate proficiency, both sending and receiving. It had been a point of pride for her. She had been fast and accurate, able to send and receive at 20 words per minute. But that had been over 40 years ago. Could she remember it after 18 years of not using it? She had to try. She had no other option. Janet began manipulating the light controls, creating a pattern of short and long flashes. The pattern for follow beam, 4 letters, each represented by a combination of dots, short flashes, and dashes, long flashes. F, dot, dot, dash, dot. O, dash, dash, dash. L, dot, dash, dot, dot. Another L. O again. W, dot, dash, dash. B, dash, dot, dot, dot. E, dot. A, dot, dash. M, dash, dash. She repeated it 3 times slowly, precisely, making sure each flash was clear and distinct. Then she paused, waiting. No response from the boat. Had they understood? Did they even know Morse code? Did they have any idea what she was trying to communicate? She tried again, this time adding more. Follow beam. Will guide you. The flashes cut through the storm, bright and deliberate. She kept the intervals steady, the pattern clear. This time, the boat's light flashed back. Short, 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 long, 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 short, short, short. SOS, the universal distress signal. But they were responding. They understood that she was trying to communicate. That was a start. Janet felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. This was really happening. She was doing this. She was back in the game, back in command, back in the moment where decisions mattered and skills determined outcomes. Her hands were steady on the controls now. The initial panic was gone, replaced by focused concentration. This was what she had been trained for. This was what she had done for 25 years. The skills were still there, buried under 18 years of quiet life, but still there when she needed them. She flashed back. Roger, SOS. Stand by for instructions. Will guide you to safety. The boat light flashed acknowledgement. Okay. Dash, dash, dash. Dash, dot, dash. Janet allowed herself one small breath of relief. They had someone on board who knew Morse code. That meant they could communicate. That meant she could guide them. That meant there was a chance. Now came the most difficult part. She needed to guide them through dangerous waters in the middle of a storm, using only light signals, relying on skills she had not used in nearly 2 decades. 3 lives depended on her making the right calls. It was exactly the situation she had been running from for 18 years. And now she had to face it head on. Part 5. The navigation. Janet stood at the manual controls, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The next part would be the most difficult. She needed to guide the boat through a safe channel while avoiding multiple hazards, all in the middle of a nor'easter with waves exceeding 15 feet and winds gusting over 70 miles per hour. She knew these waters. 18 years of living here had given her intimate knowledge of every rock, every current, every shallow spot. She had walked these shores in all weather, at all tides. She had studied the nautical charts until she could draw them from memory. She had observed how the water moved, how currents shifted with the tides, how wind affected drift patterns. Now she needed to use that knowledge. First, she needed to establish their exact position and calculate the best route to safety. Janet aimed the beam at the boat again and counted seconds as she swept it slowly from left to right. The boat was approximately 2.3 miles northeast of the lighthouse, she calculated, being pushed south-southwest by the wind and current at roughly 3 knots. At their current rate of drift, they would hit the rocks in approximately 15 to 18 minutes. The safe channel into Brookdale Harbor was to the southeast of the boat's current position. The normal approach route would require them to move roughly 90 degrees from their current drift pattern. That meant fighting the wind and current head-on, nearly impossible for a small boat with limited power and damaged steering. But there was another option, a more dangerous option, but possibly their only real chance. About half a mile north of the boat's position was a gap in the outer rocks, a narrow passage that led to slightly calmer water in the lee of the rock formation. It was rarely used even by experienced local fishermen, because it required precise navigation and was dangerous even in good weather. The passage was only about 50 feet wide in some places, with submerged rocks on both sides. One mistake and you would be on the rocks. But if the boat could reach the passage entrance, and if Janet could guide them through it successfully, they would have some protection from the worst of the wind and waves. The rocks would create a partial wind shadow, and the water would be slightly calmer. From there, Janet could guide them along the inside of the rock line to the harbor entrance, a longer route, but one that might be possible even for a damaged boat. It was risky. The passage was treacherous. But given the boat's apparent mechanical problems and the storm conditions, it might be their best, maybe their only, chance. Janet made her decision. She began flashing Morse code again. Turn north. Follow beam north. Important. There was a pause. Then the boat light flashed back. Engine weak. Steering damaged. Difficult. Janet's heart sank. Damaged steering meant they had limited control. They could use their engine, but they could not steer effectively. That made everything much harder. But she could work with that. She just needed to give them clear, simple directions that did not require precise steering. She flashed back. Understand. Use engine bursts. Follow beam. Slow progress. Okay, need north. She kept the beam steady on the boat, then slowly moved it northward, showing them the direction they needed to go. The beam was like a pointing finger, a guide, a path through the darkness. For a long moment, nothing happened. The boat continued drifting south. Janet's anxiety rose. Were they unable to follow her directions? Had they given up? Was the damage too severe? Then, slowly, Janet saw a change. The boat's bow turned slightly north. They were trying. Someone on that boat was working the engine, using short bursts of power to nudge the vessel toward the heading Janet had indicated. Good. Keep coming north. Slow is good. Steady. Janet watched through the binoculars, her heart pounding. The boat was making progress, but it was agonizingly slow. For every 2 feet they moved north, the current and wind pushed them 1 foot south. Each wave threatened to undo their progress. The wind fought them constantly. But whoever was controlling that boat knew what they were doing. They were using the engine in short, careful bursts, timing them with the waves, conserving power while making steady, if slow, progress. Minutes passed. 5 minutes. 10. 15. The boat crept northward. Janet kept the beam steady, a guiding light in the chaos. She occasionally flashed encouragement. Excellent work. Keep north. You are doing well. The storm seemed to be getting even worse. The wind had a shrieking quality now, and the rain was coming in horizontal sheets. Lightning flashed more frequently, illuminating the scene in stark bursts of white light. During one flash, Janet could clearly see the boat, a white cabin cruiser, probably about 32 feet, being thrown around by waves that looked enormous compared to the vessel's size. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only about 12 minutes, the boat reached the approximate position of the rock passage. Now came the most dangerous part. Janet had to guide them through a 50-foot wide opening in near total darkness with 15-foot waves and damaged steering. One wrong direction, one moment of confusion, one miscommunication, and they would be destroyed on the rocks. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She needed to be clear, precise, and confident. These people were trusting her with their lives. She could not afford doubt. She began flashing, "Passage ahead, very narrow, maybe 50 feet wide, rocks both sides, follow exactly, very important, acknowledge." The boat light flashed, acknowledgement. Understand, ready. Janet positioned the beam to illuminate the southern edge of the passage entrance. See rocks on left. Keep them on your left side. Entering passage now. She watched, barely breathing. The boat adjusted its heading slightly, moving toward the passage entrance. Good. Slow. Coming to opening now. Very careful. Keep south rocks on left. The boat entered the passage. Janet held her breath. Through the binoculars, even in the darkness and rain, she could see the dangerous rocks on both sides, jagged granite formations that rose and fell with each wave, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden under water. The passage walls looked impossibly close to the small boat. One large wave pushing them to either side would be catastrophic. Steady, straight ahead. Good. The boat moved forward inch by terrifying inch. Janet kept the beam carefully positioned, showing them exactly where they needed to be. She moved the light ahead of them, illuminating the path, then brought it back to check their position, then ahead again. A constant process of guidance. A particularly large wave lifted the boat high. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed to hang suspended over the rocks on the starboard side. Janet could see the rocks clearly in the light beam, could see how close the boat was to disaster. Then the wave passed and the boat dropped back down, still in the channel but barely. Good! That was close! Keep going! You are doing excellent! Halfway through. Janet's hands were white-knuckled on the controls. Every muscle in her body was tense. She had to force herself to breathe steadily. This was exactly the kind of moment she had been afraid of for 18 years. Lives depending on her decisions, success or failure measured in feet and seconds. 30 seconds crawled by. The boat continued through the passage. 3/4 through now. Janet could see the calmer water beyond the rocks, the area where they would have some shelter. Almost through. 20 more feet. Steady. Excellent work. The boat moved forward. The passage widened slightly at the end. Then, they were through. Janet allowed herself one moment of relief, one deep breath. But they were not safe yet. Now she needed to guide them along the inside of the rock line to the harbor entrance. This would be easier. The rocks provided substantial shelter from the worst of the waves, but they still had to navigate carefully. Excellent. Through passage. Well done. Now turn southeast. We'll guide to harbor. The boat light flashed back. Thank you. Following. The boat responded immediately, turning to the new heading. Janet could sense their growing confidence. They trusted her now. They had seen that her guidance was accurate, that she knew these waters, that she was keeping them safe. That trust was a heavy responsibility, but it was also empowering. This was what she had been good at, what she had loved about her career. The trust between commander and crew, the shared purpose, the knowledge that everyone was working together toward survival. Janet guided them along the rock line, carefully keeping them in the safest water. She knew every rock here, every shallow spot, every place where the current created eddies or where submerged obstacles lurked. Her beam showed them exactly where to go, and they followed her guidance precisely. Harbor entrance. Ahead 1 mile, breakwater will be on right side. Keep left of breakwater. The boat was moving faster now, using the engine more confidently. They could see the lights of Brookdale through the rain now. Other people were awake, aware that something was happening. Several houses had lights on. Janet could see vehicles near the harbor. Word had spread somehow, probably through the emergency call. The town was watching. Turn more south. Entrance straight ahead 1/2 mile. The boat made its final turn. Janet kept the beam on them, guiding them past the breakwater entrance. She could see people on the dock now, waiting to help secure the boat. Someone had emergency lights set up. The volunteer fire department had responded. You are safe. Breakwater ahead. Harbor entrance clear. Well done. Very well done. The boat passed the breakwater and entered the protected water of the harbor. Even from the lighthouse, Janet could see the change. The boat settling as the waves decreased, the crew members moving on deck, the sense of relief visible in their movements. The boat light flashed one final message, and Janet could feel the emotion behind it, even through the simple code. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You saved our lives. Janet felt tears on her cheeks, mixing with the rain that had soaked through her jacket. She had done it. After 18 years of running from her past, of hiding from her fears, of living a small, safe life, she had done it. She had saved 3 lives. She had faced exactly the situation she had been afraid of, and she had succeeded. She secured the manual controls carefully, made sure everything was set correctly, and then re-engaged the automated system. The beam resumed its normal rotation. To anyone who had not been watching, it would seem like nothing had happened. The lighthouse was just doing its job, as it had for over a century. But Janet knew better. Everything had changed. In the space of less than an hour, her entire world had shifted. She had been tested and had not failed. She had remembered who she was, what she could do, what she had been trained for. She was not just the quiet lighthouse keeper anymore. She was Commander Janet Cole, and she was back. Janet descended the lighthouse stairs slowly, her legs shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Each step seemed to require conscious effort. She felt exhausted, completely drained, but also somehow more alive than she had felt in years. The storm still raged outside, but the immediate crisis was over. 3 people who would have died were now safe, thanks to her actions. Back in the cottage, she collapsed into her reading chair by the window. Her clothes were soaked despite the supposedly waterproof gear. The storm had been too intense, too violent. She was cold, shivering slightly. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the counter. She drank it slowly, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand what it meant. The phone rang, making her jump. The sound was jarring after the intensity of the rescue. Hello? Is this Janet Cole? A man's voice, professional and urgent. Yes. This is Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reed, Coast Guard Portsmouth Station. We just received word that a boat in distress made it safely to Brookdale Harbor. Our rescue team is still en route. Can you give me a situation report? Janet's Coast Guard training kicked in automatically, providing structure to her scattered thoughts. Yes, sir. Small recreational vessel, approximately 30 to 32 feet, appears to be a cabin cruiser, 3 persons on board. They experienced engine and steering difficulties in the storm. They were drifting toward the rocks northeast of Brookdale Lighthouse, approximately 2 miles out. I used the lighthouse manual beam control to guide them to safety using Morse code communication. I directed them through the North Passage. You did what? The lieutenant commander's voice sharpened with surprise. The North Passage? In these conditions? Ms. Cole, that passage is rated as dangerous even in calm weather. I'm aware, sir. But given their mechanical difficulties and the rate of drift, attempting the normal approach route would have been impossible. The North Passage, while dangerous, provided their best chance for survival. They were approximately 15 minutes from impact with Devil's Teeth when I established contact. I see. There was a pause. Janet could hear muffled conversation in the background, someone else asking questions. Ms. Cole, our rescue team should arrive at Brookdale Harbor in approximately 20 minutes. They'll assess the situation, provide medical care if needed, and get statements from everyone involved. But I need to ask, how did you manage this rescue? The North Passage requires intimate knowledge of local waters, and using Morse code for navigation, that's extremely advanced. Janet hesitated. This was the moment she had avoided for 18 years. She could lie, deflect, give a vague answer, But she was tired of hiding. She was tired of running from who she had been. "Yes, sir. I have maritime experience. I'm retired Coast Guard. Commander Janet Cole, formerly stationed at Cape May, New Jersey. I ran the Rescue Operations Division there from 1998 to 2007. I separated from service 18 years ago." There was a long pause. "Commander Cole?" The surprise in his voice was evident. I've heard of you. You had one of the highest success rates in the entire service. You were something of a legend in rescue operations. But I thought there was an incident." "Yes," Janet said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion. "There was an incident. A fishing boat rescue during a nor'easter. We had equipment failure. One of the crew members was seriously injured during the extraction. It was..." I blamed myself. I couldn't continue. That's why I left. "I see." The lieutenant commander's voice was respectful now, gentler. "Ms. Cole, I'm going to be honest with you. I looked up that case in our archives after I heard your name. The inquiry ruled that the equipment failure was due to a manufacturer defect in the cable system. It was not operator error. The manufacturer eventually settled with the Coast Guard and the injured crew member. You did everything right in that operation. Your actions saved 4 lives." Janet felt something crack inside her chest, a dam of guilt and shame that had held for 18 years. I didn't know about the settlement. I left before the investigation was complete. I couldn't face it." The crew member recovered fully, by the way. Michael Torres. He went back to fishing for another 15 years. He retired a few years ago, lives in Rhode Island with his family. The lieutenant commander paused. "Ms. Cole?" "Commander Cole, what you did tonight was extraordinary. You saved 3 lives using skills that most people don't even remember exist anymore. Manual light control, Morse code navigation through a dangerous passage in storm conditions. That's old school, and it worked perfectly. You should be proud." "I just did what needed to be done," Janet said. "That's what heroes always say. Look, our team will be there soon to handle the immediate situation. But I want you to know that I'm going to recommend you for a Coast Guard civilian commendation. What you did goes far beyond the normal scope of lighthouse keeper duties. You are exactly the kind of person the Coast Guard was built on." "That's not necessary, sir." "I think it is. And Commander, welcome back." The call ended. Janet sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the storm beginning to weaken. The worst had passed. The wind was still strong, but not screaming anymore. The rain had lessened to a steady, heavy fall, rather than a deluge. Welcome back. Was that what had happened? Had she come back? She was too tired to think about it clearly now. She changed into dry clothes, warm flannel pajamas, thick socks, her heavy robe. She made herself a cup of hot tea with honey, something to warm her from the inside. She tried to rest, lying on her bed, but sleep would not come. Her mind kept replaying the rescue, analyzing every decision, wondering what she could have done better, celebrating what had gone right. Old habits from her command years, the constant after-action review. Around 6 a.m, as dawn began to break behind the storm clouds, there was a knock on her cottage door. Janet opened it to find a young Coast Guard officer, a woman in her 30s with short dark hair and intelligent brown eyes. "Ms. Cole? I'm Lieutenant Jennifer Hayes, Coast Guard Portsmouth Station. May I come in? I need to get your statement about what happened, and I wanted to update you on the people you rescued." "Of course. Please." Janet stepped aside. The lieutenant entered, removing her rain gear carefully to avoid dripping all over Janet's floor. She had a tablet computer and a camera. "First, I wanted to update you on the 3 people. They're all doing well, cold and scared and exhausted, but no serious injuries. The paramedics checked them out, minor hypothermia, some bruises, but nothing that requires hospitalization. They're incredibly grateful. They want to see you, to thank you in person. I'm glad they're safe. What happened to them? They're experienced sailors, actually, not amateurs. Emma Santos, Daniel Park, and Maya Chen. They run a nature photography business, and they went out yesterday afternoon to photograph the storm from the water. They've done it before safely, but this storm intensified much faster than forecast. When they tried to come back in, their steering cable snapped. Just bad luck, wrong moment. Then their radio died. Probably got wet when a wave came over the bow. They thought they were going to die. Daniel said watching the rocks get closer, knowing they were helpless. It was the most terrifying thing he's ever experienced. Janet nodded, understanding that fear viscerally. They kept their heads. Whoever was working that engine did a good job. Bursts of power at the right moments. That was Daniel. He was Navy before he became a photographer, served on a destroyer. He said your light signals were incredibly clear and precise. He has Morse code knowledge from his military training, so he understood your instructions perfectly. He said it was like having a guardian angel talking them through it. Lieutenant Hayes pulled out her tablet. If you don't mind, I need to get a formal statement from you about the rescue. For the official report. Janet spent the next hour walking through every detail of the operation. She described seeing the initial distress signal, her failed attempts to reach the Coast Guard by radio, her decision to use the manual controls, her assessment of their position and the possible routes to safety, her choice of the North Passage despite its dangers, and the step-by-step guidance through Morse code. Lieutenant Hayes recorded it all, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Her respect for Janet's actions was evident in her careful attention, in the way she made sure every detail was captured. This will go into the official report, Hayes said when they finished. And I need to tell you, Commander Reed was serious about the commendation. What you did was extraordinary. Most people don't even know these old techniques exist anymore. Manual light control, Morse code navigation, that's from a different era. But it worked perfectly because you knew what you were doing. I had good training, Janet said simply. Can I ask why you left the service? Commander Reed mentioned there was an incident, but your record before that was outstanding. Multiple commendations, highest success rate in your division, considered one of the best rescue coordinators on the East Coast. Janet looked away, out the window at the gray morning. The storm had passed, leaving heavy clouds and rough seas, but nothing like the violence of the night before. There was an operation, a fishing boat rescue during a nor'easter. Not unlike last night, actually. Similar conditions, similar urgency. We had equipment failure during the extraction. One of the crew members, Michael Torres, was seriously injured. Broken leg, internal injuries. It was my responsibility. I made the calls that led to using that equipment. I should have checked it more carefully. I should have seen the signs of wear. I should have... She trailed off. Lieutenant Hayes waited quietly, letting Janet find her words. I couldn't get past it. The inquiry cleared me. They found it was a manufacturer defect, but that didn't matter to me. Someone got hurt under my command. I blamed myself. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him falling. Every operation after that, I second-guessed every decision. I became paralyzed. I couldn't lead anymore, couldn't make those split-second calls that rescue work requires. So I left. I came here. I thought if I just did something simple and safe, if I removed myself from situations where my decisions mattered, I wouldn't have to carry that weight anymore. And did it work? Janet thought about the question carefully. For a while, maybe, or at least I convinced myself it was working. But last night, when I saw that boat in trouble, I realized something. Running from the past doesn't make it go away. It doesn't heal you. It just means you're not living fully in the present. I spent 18 years hiding. And for what? Those people would have died if I'd stayed hidden. Sometimes you have to face exactly what you're afraid of to discover you can still do it. Hayes nodded slowly. For what it's worth, Commander Reed looked up your old case file in detail. He wanted me to tell you something. The equipment failure you mentioned, it was part of a larger problem. The manufacturer had a defective batch of cables that affected multiple Coast Guard stations. There were 3 other incidents with the same equipment in the following year, before they traced it back to the source. The problem was eventually discovered through metallurgical analysis. The cables had internal stress fractures that were invisible to normal inspection. There was no way you could have known. You did everything according to protocol, and you saved 4 lives in that operation. 4 lives, Janet repeated softly. For 18 years, she had focused on the one person who was injured, not the 4 who were saved because of her actions. And Michael Torres recovered completely, like Commander Reed said. He went back to fishing. Last I heard, he has 3 grandchildren. He lived his life fully because you saved him that day. Hayes paused. And now 3 more people get to live their lives because of what you did last night. That's 7 lives, Commander. 7 people who are alive because of your skills, your training, your willingness to act when it mattered. After Hayes left, Janet stood at her window and watched the storm-damaged town beginning to wake and assess the damage. A few trees were down. Some shingles had blown off roofs. The beach was littered with debris. But the town was intact. The people were safe. And 3 additional people who should have died were sitting in the clinic drinking hot coffee and calling their families to tell them they were alive. The sun was trying to break through the clouds now, sending shafts of light through the gaps. The ocean was still rough, but it was calming. The worst had passed. And somehow, Janet felt calmer too. For the first time in 18 years, the weight she had been carrying felt lighter. Not gone. She suspected it would never be entirely gone. But lighter. Manageable. Something she could carry without it crushing her. She had faced her fear. She had done exactly what she had been afraid she could not do anymore. And she had succeeded. Maybe, just maybe, she was going to be okay. News traveled fast in Brookdale. By Sunday morning, after the storm had fully passed, everyone in town knew what Janet had done. The rescue had been witnessed by several townspeople who had been awake during the storm. Someone had filmed part of it on their phone from the harbor. Grainy, dark footage, but it clearly showed the boat being guided in by the lighthouse beam while massive waves crashed around it. When Janet walked to Morrison's general store for supplies that afternoon, people stopped her on the street. Tom Morrison came out from behind his counter to shake her hand enthusiastically. "We had no idea," he said, his eyes shining with excitement and pride. "All these years and you never said a word. Coast Guard Commander, and the way you saved those 3 people, it's all anyone can talk about. The whole town is proud of you, Janet. We're honored to have you here." "I preferred it quiet," Janet admitted, feeling overwhelmed by the attention. "Well, you're a hero now, whether you like it or not. The whole town is talking about it. Sarah at the library is beside herself. She says she's been trying to get you to share your stories for years." Tom was beaming. "We're planning a ceremony. The mayor wants to give you a commendation. The Historical Society wants to do an exhibit about the rescue. This is the most exciting thing that's happened in Brookdale in decades." Janet felt her heart sink. She had not wanted this. She had not done the rescue for recognition or attention. She had done it because people needed help, and she was the only one who could provide it. The idea of ceremonies and exhibits and being the center of attention made her deeply uncomfortable. But she could not say that to Tom, who was looking at her with such genuine pride and affection. So she smiled and said, "That's very kind, but really, I just did what anyone would do." "No," Tom said firmly. "That's not true. Most people couldn't have done what you did. The knowledge, the skills, the courage, you saved 3 lives, Janet. That's not something anyone could do. That's extraordinary." At the library on Tuesday, Sarah Martinez practically tackled her with a hug. "Janet! Oh my God, Janet! I can't believe you've been holding out on us all these years. A Coast Guard commander. And the way you saved those people. It's incredible." "It was a long time ago, Sarah," Janet said, gently extricating herself from the enthusiastic hug. "But still, the expertise you have, the experience, think of how valuable that is. You need to teach. We should have a maritime safety program at the library. You could teach navigation, weather reading, emergency procedures, maritime history. Think of how valuable that would be for this community. We're a coastal town, and most of us know almost nothing about the sea beyond what we see from the shore." Janet started to protest, but Sarah was already making plans, her enthusiasm infectious and unstoppable. She was pulling out notebooks, sketching ideas, talking about class schedules and curriculum. "We could start with basic classes for the general public, understanding tides, reading weather, basic boat safety, then more advanced courses for people who actually go out on the water, navigation, emergency procedures, rescue techniques. And you could do special programs for the schools. The kids would love it. Real expertise from someone who's actually been there, actually saved lives. Oh, this is so exciting." Maybe, Janet thought, watching Sarah's excitement. This wasn't such a bad idea. Maybe sharing her knowledge was better than keeping it locked away. Maybe there was value in teaching others what she knew, preventing future emergencies, helping people understand the sea they lived beside. "Let me think about it," she said carefully. "I'm not sure I'm ready to teach classes." "Just one class," Sarah pressed. "A trial run, Introduction to Maritime Safety. 6-week course, 1 evening per week. I bet we'd fill it immediately." "Maybe," Janet said. "Let me think about it." But even as she said it, part of her was already planning the curriculum, thinking about what people needed to know, how to present complex information in accessible ways. Old teaching skills from her Coast Guard days, when she had trained new officers, were stirring back to life. On Wednesday, Emma, Daniel, and Maya came to visit her at the lighthouse. They arrived mid-afternoon, pulling up in a rental car. Their own vehicle had apparently been damaged when a tree branch fell on it during the storm. Janet invited them into the cottage. They seemed younger than she had thought. Emma was probably late 20s, Daniel early 30s, Maya about the same. They all looked tired, with the deep exhaustion that comes after intense fear and its aftermath. "Ms. Cole," Emma said, her voice breaking with emotion, "we wanted to thank you in person. You saved our lives." "I did what anyone would do," Janet said automatically. "No," Daniel said firmly. "Most people couldn't have done what you did. I spent 6 years in the Navy. I know something about maritime operations. The way you guided us through that passage in the dark in those waves. It was like having a guardian angel. I've been sailing for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it." "Your Morse code was perfect," he continued. He was a lean man with kind eyes and hands that showed the marks of someone who worked outdoors. "My grandfather was Navy. He taught me Morse code when I was a kid. It was just a hobby, something fun we did together. I never thought I'd actually use it to save my life." "We want to do something for you," Maya said. She was a small woman with long, dark hair and intense brown eyes that suggested she saw the world in frames and compositions. "We're professional photographers and videographers. We document nature, but we also do documentary work. We want to tell your story. With your permission, of course." Janet hesitated. I don't know if that's a good idea. Please, Emma said. What you did was amazing, but it's also important. You used old skills that most people think are obsolete. You proved they still matter. You proved that traditional knowledge, traditional skills, they have value. They can save lives. And your personal story, leaving the Coast Guard, coming here, finding the courage to act when it mattered, that's inspiring. People need to hear stories like that. I'm not sure I want that kind of attention, Janet admitted. We'd be respectful, Maya promised. Nothing exploitative. A short documentary, maybe 15 to 20 minutes. We'd interview you, maybe some townspeople, show the lighthouse. Film some reenactment footage, with your guidance to make sure it's accurate. Just a way to honor what you did and to preserve the story. These stories matter. They show that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that expertise and experience have value, that courage is possible even after trauma. Janet looked at the three of them, young, earnest, grateful. They were alive because of her actions. They wanted to honor that. How could she refuse? Give me some time to think about it, she said finally. This is all very new. A week ago, nobody here knew my past. Now everyone knows, and it's a lot to process. Of course, Emma said. Take all the time you need, but please consider it, not just for us, but for everyone else who might benefit from hearing your story. After they left, Janet climbed to the top of the lighthouse and stood on the gallery deck. The ocean was calm now, sparkling in the afternoon sun as if the storm had never happened. A few boats were out, their white sails bright against the blue water. The town looked peaceful, normal, unchanged despite the drama of a few nights ago. But Janet was changed. She could feel it. The person who had climbed these stairs a week ago was not the same person standing here now. She had been a woman hiding from her past, living a half-life of safety and anonymity. Now she was something different. She was not sure exactly what yet, but she was different. After several days of thought, Janet agreed to the documentary. Emma, Daniel, and Maya spent a week in Brookdale, carefully documenting Janet's life and the rescue. They were professional and respectful, never pushing her beyond her comfort zone, always giving her control over what was shared. They interviewed townspeople, Tom Morrison talking about how reliable and helpful Janet had been over the years. Sarah Martinez describing her maritime expertise at the library. Mrs. Peterson sharing stories of Janet helping with her garden. The mayor praising her service to the community. They filmed the lighthouse, both interior and exterior. They documented Janet's daily routine, her meticulous record-keeping, her maintenance work. They interviewed Lieutenant Hayes from the Coast Guard, who explained the technical aspects of the rescue and why it was so remarkable. And they interviewed Janet herself, gently asking about her Coast Guard career, the incident that had driven her away, her years in Brookdale, and the night of the rescue. Janet found herself opening up in ways she had not expected. The camera somehow made it easier to talk about painful things. There was a distance, a formality that helped. I spent 18 years running from one bad moment, she told them during the final interview. One incident where things went wrong. And in doing that, I lost 18 years of doing what I was good at, what I loved. I let fear and guilt control my life. The night of the rescue, I had a choice. I could have stayed safe, stayed hidden, let someone else handle it. But I chose to act. And in doing that, I found myself again. I found out that the skills were still there, that I could still do it, that I was more than my worst moment. The documentary, titled The Lighthouse Keeper's Return, was released online 3 months later. Emma, Daniel, and Maya had done beautiful work, respectful, moving, and honest. It showed Janet's daily life, her quiet competence, and then the drama of the rescue. It included the Coast Guard interviews, the townspeople's testimonials, and Janet's own reflections. The documentary went viral. Within 2 weeks, it had been viewed over 5 million times. Within a month, it had passed 20 million views. News organizations picked up the story. The Coast Guard shared it on their social media. Maritime organizations featured it in their newsletters. Suddenly, Janet was famous. Interview requests poured in. The Coast Guard invited her to speak at their academy. Maritime preservation societies asked her to consult on lighthouse restoration projects. Publishers wanted her to write a book. Universities invited her to lecture. It was overwhelming. Janet declined most of the requests. She was not interested in fame, did not want to become a celebrity. But she accepted a few carefully chosen opportunities. She spoke at the Coast Guard Academy, sharing her experiences with the next generation of officers. She consulted on a project to preserve traditional maritime navigation skills. She agreed to teach maritime safety classes at the Brookdale Library, which quickly expanded to multiple sessions due to demand. The attention eventually faded, as it always does. But it left changes in its wake. Janet was no longer just the quiet lighthouse keeper. She was now a recognized expert, a teacher, a voice for maritime safety and the preservation of traditional skills. And she was okay with that. She had spent 18 years hiding. Now she was living openly, using her expertise, helping others. It felt right. It felt like coming home to herself. The attention eventually faded, as it always does in the modern world of short attention spans and constant news stories. But the changes it brought to Janet's life remained. 6 months after the rescue, she had settled into a new routine that honored both her past and her present. She still lived in the lighthouse cottage, still performed her duties as keeper. But her life had expanded in ways she never could have imagined during those 18 years of hiding. The maritime safety classes she started teaching at the Brookdale Community Center became incredibly popular. She began with one class, Introduction to Maritime Safety, just as Sarah had suggested, but it filled immediately and had a waiting list. So she added more classes. Advanced Navigation for Small Craft, Weather Reading and Forecasting, Emergency Procedures on the Water, and Maritime History and Traditional Skills. Janet discovered that she loved teaching. Sharing her knowledge felt good, felt right, felt like finally using the expertise she had spent so many years acquiring. Her students ranged from teenagers learning to sail to experienced fishermen wanting to sharpen their skills to elderly residents who had lived by the ocean their whole lives but wanted to understand it better. She was a demanding teacher, but patient, expecting her students to work hard but supporting them when they struggled. She combined theoretical knowledge with practical demonstrations. She took classes out on boats in good weather, showing them firsthand how to read currents and waves. She brought in equipment and taught proper maintenance. She told stories from her Coast Guard career, carefully chosen stories that illustrated important points without traumatizing anyone. Her teaching style was direct and clear. She did not sugarcoat the dangers of the ocean, but she also emphasized that knowledge and preparation could manage most risks. The sea is not your enemy, she told her students. It's a powerful force that requires respect and understanding. Know what you're doing, prepare properly, stay alert, and you can be safe out there. The Coast Guard invited her to consult on a project to modernize emergency communication protocols while preserving essential backup systems. Your rescue proved that old methods still have value, Commander Reed told her during a meeting at the Portsmouth station. Modern technology is wonderful. GPS, satellite communication, automated systems, but they can fail. We need people who understand both the modern systems and the traditional skills. We need to train officers to navigate by compass and stars, to communicate with signal flags and Morse code, to make decisions based on experience and observation, not just on what the computer tells them. Janet accepted the consulting position. She spent several months working with Coast Guard teams, helping them develop training programs that incorporated traditional navigation and communication skills alongside modern technology. She wrote manuals, developed exercises, and even taught some classes at the Coast Guard Academy. It was satisfying work. She was helping to ensure that the knowledge she had acquired over her career would not be lost, that future generations would have the full toolkit available when they needed it. She was building bridges between old and new, showing that tradition and innovation could complement each other rather than competing. The documentary about her life continued to have an impact. Janet received letters from people around the world, some thanking her for her service, some sharing their own stories of trauma and recovery, some asking for advice about career decisions or life choices. One letter particularly moved her. It was from Michael Torres, the crew member who had been injured 18 years ago. "Dear Commander Cole," it began, "Lieutenant Hayes gave me your contact information. I hope you don't mind my writing to you. I've wanted to reach out for years, but I didn't know where you were. I need you to know something that I wish I could have told you 18 years ago. What happened during that rescue was not your fault. I've never blamed you for my injury. Not for 1 second. You saved my life and the lives of my crew. The equipment failure was something no one could have predicted or prevented. I recovered fully within 6 months. I went back to fishing and worked for another 15 years before retiring. I have a wife, 3 children, and now 3 grandchildren. I got to live my life, to see my children grow up, to hold my grandchildren. None of that would have happened if you hadn't made the decisions you made that day. I heard about what you did in Brookdale. It doesn't surprise me. You were always the best at what you did. I'm glad you're using your skills again, helping others. The world needs people like you. People who know what they're doing and have the courage to act. I hope you can forgive yourself for what happened. I forgave the situation 18 years ago. There was never anything to forgive you for. You're a hero, Commander. You were then, and you are now. With deep respect and gratitude, Michael Torres." Janet read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. For 18 years, she had carried guilt and shame. She had let one incident define her, limit her, cage her. But Michael had moved on. He had lived his life fully, raised children and grandchildren, found peace and happiness. She had been punishing herself for something that the other person involved had never held against her. She had been carrying a burden that did not need to be carried. It was time to let go. Past time, really. That evening, Janet climbed to the top of the lighthouse and stood on the gallery deck, watching the sun set over the ocean. The sky was painted in shades of orange, pink, and purple. The water was calm, reflecting the colors like a mirror. A few boats were heading back to harbor, their day's work done. She thought about her life, the years in the Coast Guard, the incident that had driven her away, the 18 years in hiding, and finally the rescue that had brought her back to herself. It had been a long journey, full of pain and fear and regret, but it had also brought her here, to this moment, to this place of peace and purpose. She was 66 years old. She had wasted 18 years hiding from her past. She was not going to waste whatever time she had left. She was going to live, fully, openly, purposefully. She was going to use her knowledge to help others. She was going to teach, to share, to mentor. She was going to honor the skills she had learned and the service she had given. She was Commander Janet Cole, United States Coast Guard, retired. and she was ready to move forward. Winter settled over Brookdale, bringing snow and ice. The lighthouse stood faithful watch, its beam cutting through snowstorms and clear nights alike. Janet continued her work, but with renewed purpose and energy that surprised even her. Her maritime safety classes expanded throughout the winter. She began offering specialized courses for different groups: fishing crews who wanted to review emergency procedures, recreational boaters preparing for the spring season, even children's classes teaching basic ocean safety and literacy. "You have a gift for this," Commander Reed told her during one of his visits to observe her teaching methods. The Coast Guard was considering adopting some of her curriculum for their own training programs. "You make complex concepts accessible, and you do it with real-world experience that carries weight. When you tell students something is important, they believe you because they know you've been there." Janet also began working on a comprehensive manual, a guide to traditional maritime navigation and communication methods. "These skills shouldn't be lost," she explained to Sarah Martinez one afternoon at the library. Sarah had offered to help her edit the manuscript, and they were working together at one of the library tables, surrounded by reference books and navigational charts. "But don't we have GPS now? And satellite phones?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "We do. And they're wonderful tools, reliable, accurate, easy to use, but they can fail. Batteries die, electronics break, satellites go offline. If you're out on the water and your technology fails, you need to know how to navigate by compass and stars, how to read the weather, how to signal for help without a radio. Those traditional skills are your backup system, your safety net." The manual took shape slowly over the winter months. Janet drew on 40 years of experience, her Coast Guard career, and her years as a lighthouse keeper. She included detailed instructions for celestial navigation, compass work, dead reckoning, weather prediction, signal flag communication, Morse code, emergency procedures, and dozens of other traditional maritime skills. She illustrated it with diagrams, charts, and real-world scenarios drawn from her own experience. "This is going to be an important book," Sarah said one evening, as she read through a draft chapter on storm navigation. "This isn't just a how-to manual. It's a preservation of knowledge that could literally save lives." "That's the goal," Janet said. "I want people to have access to this knowledge. I want future generations to be able to learn these skills even if there's no one left who can teach them in person." In February, she received an unexpected visitor. A young woman in her early 30s, wearing a Coast Guard uniform, knocked on the cottage door on a cold Tuesday afternoon. "Ms. Cole, I'm Lieutenant Emma Rodriguez. I was hoping I could speak with you." "Of course. Come in." Janet showed her into the cottage and made coffee. Over steaming mugs, Lieutenant Rodriguez explained her visit. "I saw the documentary about your rescue, and I read about your career. I've been researching you." She paused, looking uncomfortable. "The thing is, I'm considering leaving the Coast Guard. I had a difficult operation last year, a rescue attempt that didn't go well. We lost someone, a kayaker who got into trouble off the coast of Massachusetts. By the time we got to him, it was too late. He had hypothermia, went into cardiac arrest. We tried everything, but we couldn't save him." Janet listened quietly, recognizing her own story in the young woman's words. "I can't stop thinking about it," Rodriguez continued, her voice tight with emotion. "I keep going over it in my mind, wondering what I could have done differently. Should we have launched sooner? Should I have taken a different approach vector? Was there a moment where the right decision could have saved him? And now you're wondering if you should leave," Janet said gently. "If maybe you're not cut out for this work. If maybe one more operation like that will break you completely." Rodriguez looked up, tears in her eyes. "Yes, Exactly that. I thought if I left, started fresh somewhere else, the dreams would stop. The second guessing would stop. I could just not carry this anymore. But then you saw what happened with me, Janet said. How I left, but the pain came with me. How hiding from it didn't make it better. Yes, and how it wasn't until you faced exactly what you were afraid of. Another rescue, another storm, another moment where lives depended on your decisions, that you found peace. Rodriguez set down her coffee mug. I guess I'm here to ask, what should I do? Should I stay? Should I go? How do I know? Janet thought carefully before answering. This was important. This young woman's career, her mental health, possibly her life, all balanced on what Janet said next. I can't answer that for you, she said finally. Everyone's situation is different. What was right for me, leaving, might not be right for you. What eventually worked for me, facing my fears and finding that I could still function, might not be what you need. But you have insight. You've been through this. I do. And I can tell you what I learned for what it's worth. Janet leaned forward. First, what happened was not your fault. Unless you made a clear error in judgment, unless you violated protocol or did something negligent, then what happened was just what happened. The ocean is dangerous. Rescue work is dangerous. Sometimes people die despite our best efforts. That's a hard truth, but it's truth. The inquiry cleared me, Rodriguez said quietly. They said we responded appropriately, that the timeline was reasonable, that we did everything we could. But it doesn't feel like that. It never does. That's the nature of this work. We hold ourselves to impossible standards because we care so deeply. Janet paused. Second thing I learned, running from it doesn't solve the problem. I left the Coast Guard thinking that if I removed myself from responsibility, I'd be free of the guilt. But guilt doesn't work that way. It comes with you. I spent 18 years hiding, and I was still carrying that burden every single day. So I should stay? Maybe. But here's the third thing, and this is important. Staying doesn't mean staying the same way. If you're having nightmares, if you're second-guessing every decision, if you're not functioning well, then you need help. Professional help. Therapy, PTSD treatment if needed. The Coast Guard has resources for this now. They didn't when I was serving, or at least not good ones. Use them. Rodriguez nodded slowly. And fourth, Janet continued, whether you stay or go, find a way to process the trauma, to learn from it without letting it destroy you. The person you lost, would they want you to leave the Coast Guard because of what happened? Rodriguez thought about it, her eyes distant. No. Tom, that was his name. He was an experienced kayaker. He knew the risks. He would say that I should learn from what happened, should honor his memory by being better at what I do, not by running away from it. Then maybe that's your answer. Stay. Get help processing the trauma. Learn everything you can from what happened. And then use that knowledge to be the best officer you can be. Turn the tragedy into meaning. Make his death count for something by ensuring it makes you better at saving the next person. They talked for another hour, Janet sharing more of her own journey, Rodriguez asking thoughtful questions and really listening to the answers. When she finally left, she looked lighter, more hopeful, like someone who had found a path forward. After she was gone, Janet realized that this was part of her new purpose too. Not just teaching maritime skills, but mentoring others who struggled with the same demons she had faced. People who carried guilt and trauma from difficult operations. People who wondered if they could continue, if they should continue. She was uniquely qualified to help them because she had been there. She knew what that darkness looked like from the inside. And she knew that there was a way through it if you were brave enough to face it. That evening, she sent an email to Commander Reed. I'd like to develop a program for Coast Guard personnel dealing with operational trauma, something that combines peer support with professional mental health resources. I think I could be useful in this area. His reply came within an hour. I think you're absolutely right. Let's talk about how to make this happen. She was going to live fully, openly, purposefully. She was going to use her knowledge to help others. She was going to teach, to share, to mentor. She was going to honor the skills she had learned and the service she had given. She was Commander Janet Cole, United States Coast Guard, retired, and she was ready to move forward. Spring came to Brookdale, bringing warmer weather and longer days. The ice melted from the harbor. The fishing boats went out earlier and stayed out longer. Tourists began trickling back, scouts for the summer season. Janet's life had found a new rhythm. She still kept the lighthouse. That would always be her primary job, her anchor, her home. But now that work was supplemented by teaching, consulting, mentoring, and writing. She was busier than she had been in years, but it was a good kind of busy, purposeful, meaningful. One warm April morning, she received a package in the mail. It was from the Coast Guard. Inside was a civilian commendation certificate, beautifully designed, officially sealed, recognizing her for her actions during the rescue. There was also a letter from the Commandant of the Coast Guard, thanking her for her service both during her active career and for her continued contributions to maritime safety. But it was the third item in the package that really moved her: a letter from Michael Torres. They had been corresponding since his first letter, exchanging stories and updates every few weeks. He had become something of a friend despite their shared history, or perhaps because of it. His letters were warm, full of details about his grandchildren, his retirement, his simple pleasures. This letter was longer than usual. He had been thinking about heroism, he wrote, about what it meant to save someone's life. He wanted Janet to know that she had not just saved him that day 18 years ago. She had saved everyone who loved him: his wife, his children, his parents. She had saved all the experiences he had been able to have, all the joy and love and laughter of the past 18 years. She had given him a lifetime, and he was grateful every single day. I heard you're teaching now, he wrote. That makes me happy. You're taking everything you learned, all that expertise, and you're passing it on. That's another kind of life-saving, isn't it? Teaching people skills that might save them someday. You're still doing what you always did, making the ocean a safer place. Janet read the letter 3 times, sitting at her kitchen table with morning coffee and tears on her cheeks. Michael was right. She was still saving lives, just in a different way. Not in dramatic midnight rescues, though she would do that again if needed, but through patient teaching, through sharing knowledge, through helping people understand and respect the ocean. It was all connected. Her Coast Guard career, the incident that had driven her away, the years of hiding, the rescue that had brought her back, the teaching and mentoring she was doing now. It was all one continuous story of service. The path had been winding and painful at times, but it had brought her here, and here was good. In May, the Coast Guard invited her to speak at their graduation ceremony. Standing before hundreds of new Coast Guard officers and their families, Janet felt the weight and honor of the moment. She told them her story, not to make herself seem heroic, but to teach them something important. She told them about her successful career, about the incident that had driven her away, about the years of hiding, about the rescue that had brought her back. I left the Coast Guard 18 years ago, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the large hall. I left because I believed I had failed, that I was responsible for someone getting hurt, that I no longer deserve to serve. I was wrong about most of that. But what I want you to understand is this. You will face difficult moments in your careers. You will make decisions that don't turn out the way you hoped. You might experience operations where people get hurt or where you can't save everyone. She paused, looking out at the young faces watching her intently. When those moments come, you have choices about how you respond. You can let them define you, limit you, drive you away from the work you love. Or you can learn from them, grow from them, use them to become better officers. You can process the trauma with help from professionals and peers. You can find meaning in difficult experiences. I chose to run. I spent 18 years in hiding, convincing myself I was healing when mostly I was just avoiding. Don't make that mistake. When you face trauma, and many of you will, face it directly. Get help. Talk about it. Process it. Learn from it. But don't let it steal your career, your purpose, your identity. The Coast Guard needs capable, experienced officers. It needs people who have faced difficult situations and learned from them. It needs people who understand that life and death work involves risk, and that sometimes, despite your best efforts, things go wrong. You are more than your worst day. You are more than your biggest mistake. You are defined not by your failures, but by how you respond to them, by what you do next, by whether you find the courage to keep serving despite the challenges. She concluded with the story of the Brookdale rescue, explaining how facing her fears had ultimately set her free. I could have stayed inside that night. I could have called the Coast Guard and left it to them. I could have stayed safe and comfortable and hidden. But 3 people would have died, and I would have missed the chance to discover that I was still capable, still skilled, still able to make a difference when it mattered. The Coast Guard motto is Semper Paratus, always ready. Be ready not just for rescues and emergencies, but for the personal challenges that will come. Be ready to ask for help when you need it. Be ready to support your shipmates when they struggle. Be ready to learn from mistakes without being destroyed by them. Be ready to serve with courage and compassion. Be ready to be the officers I know you can be. The speech received a standing ovation that went on for several minutes. Afterward, dozens of new officers came up to thank her, to shake her hand, to ask questions. Several told her about their own doubts and fears. She listened to each one, offering what wisdom she could, sharing her email address for anyone who wanted to stay in touch. On the flight back to Maine, Janet reflected on how far she had come. 2 years ago, she had been a woman hiding in a lighthouse, running from her past, living a half-life of safety and anonymity. Now she was someone who spoke at Coast Guard graduations, who taught maritime safety, who mentored struggling officers, who was writing a manual that would preserve traditional knowledge for future generations. She was not the person she had been during her Coast Guard career, that confident, driven, somewhat rigid Commander Cole. But she was not the hiding, fearful lighthouse keeper of 18 years either. She was something new, something that incorporated both versions of herself. She was stronger for having been broken, wiser for having made mistakes, more compassionate for having suffered. She was, finally, comfortable in her own skin. 5 years after the rescue, Janet Cole was 71 years old. She still lived in the lighthouse cottage, still maintained the tower, still climbed those spiral stairs every morning to greet the dawn. The rhythm of lighthouse keeping remained the foundation of her life. But what a different life it had become. Her maritime safety manual had been published by a major academic press and was now used by Coast Guard training programs, maritime academies, and sailing schools across the country. It had won awards from maritime heritage organizations and had been translated into 6 languages. She received letters from people around the world who had learned from her book, who had used the skills she taught, who credited her with helping them stay safe on the water. Her support group for people dealing with operational trauma had expanded far beyond its original scope. What had started as a small group meeting twice a month in the Brookdale Community Center was now a network of similar groups in coastal communities across New England. Janet trained facilitators, developed curriculum, and consulted with mental health professionals to create an evidence-based program that really helped people heal. She had reconnected with many former Coast Guard colleagues. Some had retired, like her. Others were still serving, working their way up through the ranks. They sought her advice, asked her to speak at their units, invited her to ceremonies and commemorations. She was no longer estranged from the service she had loved. She was an honored member of its extended family. Emma, Daniel, and Maya had become close friends. They visited several times a year, always bringing new projects and ideas. They had dedicated their photography business to documenting everyday heroes, people like Janet who did extraordinary things without seeking recognition. The documentary about Janet had inspired their entire career direction. The 3 people she had saved had gone on to live full lives. Emma had gotten married to a marine biologist she met while photographing whales. They had a daughter named Janet in honor of her rescuer. Emma sent photos regularly. Birthday parties, beach days, first words, first steps. Watching this child grow up, knowing she existed because of that one night of action, never failed to move Janet. Daniel had published a book of storm photographs, with a chapter dedicated to the night of his rescue. He had included some of the footage from the harbor, along with a detailed account of what it felt like to be guided through the darkness by Janet's light. The book had become a bestseller in maritime photography circles. Maya had started teaching photography workshops that emphasized using art to process trauma. She credited the rescue experience, the terror, the relief, the processing, with teaching her about the connection between creativity and healing. Lieutenant Rodriguez, the young officer who had visited seeking guidance, had stayed in the Coast Guard. She had worked through her trauma with professional help, had used the experience to become a better officer. She was a commander now, running a mental health support program for Coast Guard personnel dealing with operational stress. She credited Janet with helping her find her path. On November nights, especially when storms rolled in, Janet would climb to the top of the lighthouse and stand on the gallery deck, just as she had done 5 years ago. She would watch the beam rotating, cutting through darkness and storm, a constant light in an uncertain world. She understood now what the lighthouse represented. Not just a navigation aid for ships, but a symbol of constancy, of hope, of guidance. A symbol of the idea that even in the darkest storms, there was a light showing the way to safety. For 18 years, she had tended the light while keeping her own light hidden, dimmed by guilt and fear. But that November night, when 3 people needed help, she had let her light shine again. And in doing so, she had found her way back to herself. The lighthouse beam continued its rotation, steady and sure. Just like Janet. Just like the person she had become. No longer hiding, no longer running, but standing tall and shining bright, ready to help anyone who needed guidance through the darkness. She was Commander Janet Cole, United States Coast Guard, retired. She was the lighthouse keeper of Brookdale. She was a teacher, a mentor, a friend, a hero to 3 people who owed her their lives, and an inspiration to countless others who had heard her story. But most importantly, she was herself, complete, whole, and at peace. The light continued to shine, and so did she. On a warm summer evening, 10 years after the rescue, Janet sat on the bench outside her cottage, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The ocean was calm, reflecting the colors like a mirror. A few boats were heading back to harbor after a day on the water. She was 76 now. Her hair was completely white, her face lined with age and experience. She moved a bit more slowly than she once had, though she still climbed the lighthouse stairs every day. She was healthy, active, and engaged with the world in ways that would have seemed impossible during those 18 years of hiding. A car pulled up, and a young woman got out. She was in her early 20s, with Emma Santos's eyes and smile. Little Janet, not so little anymore, a college student studying marine biology. "Hi, Aunt Janet." She had started calling her that years ago, and Janet had never objected. They were not related by blood, but they were connected by something deeper. By the storm that had nearly taken her mother's life, by the rescue that had saved it, by the gratitude and affection that had grown over the years. "Hello, my dear. What brings you by?" "I wanted to tell you something exciting. I got accepted into the Coast Guard Academy's Civilian Maritime Safety Program. I'll be studying rescue operations and maritime emergency management." Janet felt tears spring to her eyes. "That's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." Young Janet sat down beside her. "I've been thinking about it for years. About what you did, about how you saved my mom and the others, about how knowledge and skill and courage can make such a difference. I want to do that too. I want to be someone who helps people, who makes the ocean safer." "You'll be excellent at it," Janet said, meaning it. "You have your mother's determination and your father's analytical mind. And you've grown up understanding the ocean, respecting it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower. "Can I ask you something?" young Janet said finally. "Do you ever regret those 18 years? The time you spent hiding?" Janet considered the question carefully. Yes and no. Yes, because they were wasted years in some ways. I could have been teaching, helping, serving all that time. I let fear control me when I should have been living. But also no, because those years shaped who I became. They taught me humility. They taught me to appreciate simple things. They gave me time to heal, even if I wasn't healing consciously. And they brought me here, to this place, to this community, to this life. If I hadn't come here, I wouldn't have been here that night to save your mother. So maybe those years weren't wasted. Maybe they were just necessary. "I like that perspective," young Janet said. "Nothing wasted, just necessary." After she left, Janet climbed the lighthouse stairs one more time. At the top, she stood on the gallery deck and looked out at the darkening sky. The stars were beginning to appear, brilliant pinpoints in the deepening blue. This had been her life's work, she realized. Not just the 25 years in the Coast Guard, and not just the one dramatic rescue. It was all of it. The service, the mistake, the hiding, the return, the teaching, the mentoring, the writing, the healing. It was the whole journey, with all its detours and wrong turns and painful moments. And somehow, it had all led here, to this place of peace and purpose, to a life that mattered, that made a difference, that helped others. She thought about all the people she had touched over the years, the hundreds she had rescued during her Coast Guard career, the 3 she had saved that stormy November night, the thousands she had taught through her classes and her book, the dozens she had mentored through their own traumas, and now young Janet, inspired to follow in her footsteps, to carry the work forward into the next generation. That was legacy. That was meaning. That was purpose. The lighthouse beam began its nightly rotation, cutting through the darkness with practiced precision. Janet watched it for a moment, then went back down to her cottage. She had a good life. She had found her way back from darkness to light. She had learned that mistakes did not define you, that trauma could be survived, that courage was possible even after fear had nearly destroyed you. She was the lighthouse keeper. She was the light, and she would keep shining for as long as she was able for anyone who needed guidance through the darkness. That was her purpose. That was her calling. That was her gift to the world. The light continued to shine. The beam continued to rotate. The lighthouse stood solid and sure, a beacon on the rocky coast. And Janet Cole was home. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.